What's up, folks? Welcome back to the Whoop podcast, where we sit down with the best of the best. I'm your host, Will Ahmed, founder and CEO of Whoop, and we are on a mission to what? Unlock human performance. That's right. On this week's episode, Whoop VP of Performance Science, Principal Scientist, the fearless, the epic Kristen Holmes is joined by Simon Hill. Simon is a physiotherapist, nutritionist, and author on a mission to help people make informed lifestyle choices. In 2021, he published his first book, The Proof is in the Plants, which makes a case for a plant-based whole food diet, drawing on all the latest nutrition research. As of 2023, his podcast, The Proof with Simon Hill, has been listened to over 30 million times. The Proof extends beyond nutrition to other crucial lifestyle factors that impact our well-being. Kristen and Simon discuss Simon's book and the research behind his philosophy, creating a diet that is suitable for the individual, essentially understanding how your body reacts to certain food groups, an in-depth look at the plant-based and whole grain diets, the power of legumes and some of the myths around them, how to get enough protein on a plant-based diet. This is something I was certainly interested in. They touch on plenty of non-meat alternatives that are loaded with protein, how Whoop members are tracking various diets, and how nutrition can be linked to sustainability and the environment. If you're looking to join Whoop, you can visit our website and sign up for free. That's right, free 30-day trial. If you like it, become a member. If you don't, send it back. It's that simple. You can also use the code WILL at checkout, WILL, get a $60 credit on apparel and accessories. If you have a question you want to see answered on the podcast, email us, podcast@whoop.com. Call us, 508-443-4952, and it might just be answered on a future episode. This is obviously a very diet-focused and nutrition-focused podcast, and it's also very oriented towards plant-based. I want to be clear that Whoop does not have a strong opinion on what diet you should be on, but we do believe it's a highly personal decision in that whatever diet you're on is going to affect your body and probably your body differently. So you should manage it by measuring it. And as part of that, we've also had other people come on the podcast, most recently Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, who talked about the importance of a meat-based, heavily protein-oriented diet. We got a lot of feedback on that podcast, so now we're showing the other side of the spectrum, which is plant-based. We'll continue to have more folks on. Without further ado, here are Kristen Holmes and Simon Hill.
Simon received a Master of Science in Human Nutrition from Deakin University. During this time, he established his podcast, The Proof with Simon Hill, where he hosts world-renowned doctors and public figures who share their significant experience in translating the latest research into actionable lifestyle recommendations. As of today, Simon's podcast has been listened to over 30 million times. Simon, welcome.
Kristen, pleasure. Thank you for having me in this beautiful space.
I know. I'm so excited for this conversation. Admittedly, this is an area that I don't know a lot about, so I know I'm going to learn a ton today. So I'm really excited for that. I wanted to start in 2021, you published the book, The Proof is in the Plants. Congratulations on that.
In the middle of a pandemic.
Totally.
Maybe not the best timing, but
No. Well, I'd love for you to describe just the thesis of that book and really what motivated you to kind of take on what is not an easy project.
the motivation was I felt like people are extremely confused about what to eat for good long-term health.
Yeah.
And I think talking to friends and family members and people that I was working with, it almost seemed like people felt as if we didn't have enough information to even inform our food choices, and that all the science was conflicting. And you could find any science to support any view, which that part is true. But it's not as though science is completely conflicting or confused. I understand why people may feel that way, but when you have the actual skills to get into the research and understand and appreciate the context, and that's key. So when you're digging into certain studies, you're thinking about things like the dose of a nutrient or a food, how much is someone eating, or if you're considering a particular nutrient or food, what are you comparing it against?
Right.
In a study that's comparing high and low, what is high and low? These are relative terms.
Yeah.
So how much contrast is there between that exposure of interest. What subject group are we looking at? Are we looking at children? Are we looking at pregnant women? Are we looking at postmenopausal women? Are we looking at elderly?
What is the control? Like,
right,
it's
control.
a huge
What
problem. Yeah.
what outcomes are we interested in? Are we looking at surrogate things like changes to blood biomarkers like cholesterol or ApoB, blood glucose markers? Are we looking at triglycerides, or are we looking at hard health outcomes like increase in strength or cardiovascular events like a heart attack or a stroke or the development of a certain type of cancer? And then, beyond that, for who, if we're looking at a particular compound of food, we then also have to appreciate that there are some genetic differences as well between people. And it's not until you're actually aware of that context and then appreciating it and looking across a body of literature and not at a single piece of evidence.
Yeah.
Each single piece of evidence is important, but it has to be considered within the wider body of literature looking at that and appreciating that not all study designs are equal in terms of validity and reliability.
Right.
So when you consider all that, and I think when I explain that, people go, wow, there's a lot to this. Yeah. But when you are appreciating that, it becomes very clear that while there's not like one diet that I can say, Chris, here's a prescription for just eat exactly this. It's not that clear. There's a bit of grayness, but there's a theme that I like to describe to people. And that was the central part of my thesis in my book, was to help people understand that theme. It's diets that are low in saturated fats. They tend to be rich in unsaturated fats, particularly polyunsaturated fats. We can get into what this looks like from a food perspective.
Yeah.
It's diets that are high in fiber. They provide a good amount of protein based on that person's needs, their activity levels and goals, and has a bias for plant protein. It can contain animal protein, but certainly compared to the average person's diet today, 85% of proteins from animal foods, it's more emphasized, there's more emphasis on plant protein, and it's low in ultra processed foods. And so that thing might seem a little bit vague to people, and we want absolutes. And that's why books that are selling you an absolute, that's why they sell so well and they're on the bestsellers list. And
people gravitate to dogma because it simplifies things.
It simplifies things. And I understand that. Like, there is some beauty to simplifying something so that people can grab hold of it.
Sure.
So I don't want to make it too gray. The way that I kind of tie that together is say that theme that I just described is generally achieved in plant predominant to exclusive diets. But that could be a Mediterranean diet, which in the literature is described as a form of plant-based diet.
Right.
It could be a pescatarian diet, the DASH diet, which is used in the literature a lot for blood pressure management, another form of plant-based eating, vegetarian or plant-exclusive diet. And the commonality of all of those dietary patterns and why they reduce your risk of cardiometabolic disease in particular, which covers most of the diseases that are reducing health span, increasing the number of years where people have lower quality of life. All of those diets are low in saturated fat, have a good amount of unsaturated fats. They're rich in fiber. They have much more plant protein than the average diet today, and they're low in ultra processed foods. The nice thing about that is there is a lot of variations of this theme. So you have choice. And in working with many people, it's become super clear to me that the biggest problem or hurdle that we have, obstacle, it's not that we actually need to know more information about what to eat. We actually just need to be able to do what we know. And the hardest thing is adherence.
Yeah.
It's finding something that you enjoy. It's healthy for you. So it's looking after your health today. You feel great today. It's going to reduce your risk of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, having a heart attack, etc. And you can stick to it over decades, because that's what, when we're talking about food, it's all about lifetime exposure.
Right.
It's very much like cigarettes, where people talk about pack years. That's how we have to think about our diet. I would rather people try and find one of those variations and do it imperfectly over decades than do something perfectly for 2 weeks. And so that's the kind of, I guess, the central thesis to
Right.
the book that I wrote in 2021 when it comes to nutrition. And then in the book, I also expanded upon the conversation and spoke about some benefits of leaning more towards plant exclusive diets, in terms of the effect on the environment, which I think that research is super clear, and of course, animal welfare. And my position was not to tell people to go vegan. It was that if we're going to have a conversation that is about food and goes beyond just our health, I think firstly you have to separate it. You need to be able to talk about how food affects your health separately, because often that line's blurred. You see it online, it becomes very emotional. Then you can talk about the environment and animal welfare. And I think there is a strong case to adopt a diet as plant exclusive for you. Mm-hmm. So again, that comes back to the individual can be the only person that can actually assess that based on their circumstances, how they're feeling, their lab work, their goals, all of those things.
Talk a little bit how you kind of, I imagine in your book, you elucidate the difference between kind of diet and lifestyle. Just maybe, and I heard that as one of the core themes, just maybe expand a little bit on if people were to just engage in a diet, for 2, 4, 6, 8 weeks, versus like a lifestyle. What does that behavior change actually look like? And how do you frame that up for an individual?
I think when we approach diet, yes, the mindset is more temporary. This is an on-off type thing. But it comes back to understanding that if our goal is long-term health, so that's got to be a starting point. Firstly, people need to understand what is their goal. And also that comes back to what are your values. So often we just skip over all of that and then we're making changes to our diet, but we're really not sure why we're making those changes. Or it's something superficial. And for me, the superficial thing, it can be a good motivator initially, but often you need something a little deeper for it to stick long term. Or you get the result you're looking for, the superficial result. We've all done it, and then you just drop off.
Yeah.
and 6 months later you do it again, and that's kind of yo-yo dieting. So the difference is that you're in it for the long game. You understand that in terms of how these foods affect your physiology, so how insulin resistant you are, the way your heart's working, your liver function, the way your brain's operating, it's about chronic exposure. It's what you're doing over decades that really matters. So I think we have to get out of this mindset of diet now and something that we're just kind of hopping on and off, and instead try and find some variation of that theme that you can stick to over the course of your life, and it would vary a little as well.
Yeah. What were some of the key scientific findings that you highlighted in your book that kind of led you to believe that plant-based kind of whole food diet is really the path?
Yeah. Each of those different dietary foods that I mentioned that fit in that theme, you see a lot of the very consistent results in terms of how they're affecting people's health. So, first and foremost, as you're shifting from more of a standard diet to any of those variations, you're seeing improved pressure in the realm of 10 millimeters of mercury drop in systolic blood pressure. To give people context to how important is that? Every 20 millimeter increase in systolic blood pressure, you double your risk of heart attack, stroke, or other vascular events. So we're talking about a quarter, so 25% reduction in your risk of any of those events by adopting one of these dietary patterns if your systolic blood pressure comes down from, say, 130 to 120, where we want it.
So dietary patterns. So you're talking pescatarian, vegan, vegetarian, Mediterranean, those four, right? Okay.
Yeah. So, and maybe we define those if you want.
Yeah, that might be helpful. Yeah.
Like the basic premise of all of those is that whole grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, lots of fruits and vegetables, these are filling the plate.
Right.
And in the Mediterranean diet, there's room in there for meat. It's usually more like white meat and fatty fish. There's some dairy in there. And that's very similar to the DASH diet. And in many ways, they're
what's that acronym stand for? To just
dietary approach to stopping hypertension, I think.
Okay.
So that's similar, and there's a low sodium kind of DASH diet as well. And then vegetarian is mostly plant based. There's some dairy and some eggs, depending on the type of vegetarian diet that someone adopts. Pescatarian is that plus fish, and then a vegan diet is completely plant exclusive. But I guess we should be very clear here: you can do a vegan diet very poorly. We're talking about one that's not full of ultra processed vegan foods. It's those whole foods that make up the majority of calories. And the reason why these diets reduce blood pressure is when you're eating that way relative to a standard diet, you get a huge reduction in sodium intake. You get a big increase in potassium intake. That lowers blood volume, which lowers blood pressure.
Right.
And hypertension or high blood pressure is a huge risk factor for cardiovascular disease. We've made massive inroads in terms of reducing cardiovascular mortality, and a lot of that is through pharmacology and also reducing cigarette smoking. But if we want to squeeze cardiovascular disease out of society, we have to address hypertension. These diets help with that. We also have to address LDL cholesterol, or more specifically ApoB. That's a long discussion to explore what ApoB is, but let me just say high level, this is now believed to be a much stronger predictor of cardiovascular risk than LDL cholesterol. And you can ask your physician to
listen to Peter Attia. He talks a whole lot about ApoB.
Yes, so you can listen to Peter Attia. I did a 7 or 8 hour long series with Thomas Dayspring, who Peter Attia has also had on. And that came out like 4 or 5 months ago. And it's like, if you really want to deep dive ApoB, then do that.
We'll make sure we link to that.
But all of these diets will help lower someone's ApoB. And they do that because they have the emphasis on unsaturated fats and de-emphasize saturated fat. And just very quickly, the mechanism there is saturated fats essentially, they downregulate a receptor in your liver and make it much harder to clear cholesterol, to clear ApoB. Whereas the unsaturated, particularly polyunsaturated fats in fatty fish, nuts, and seeds, they open up those receptors and allow you to clear more. So these diets will shift that potent risk factor in the right direction. All of these diets as well will help improve insulin sensitivity. That's through a couple of different mechanisms. One is, as you lower your body weight, you become more insulin sensitive. And naturally, when you eat the way that I'm describing, this is a lower calorie density diet. And we know that calorie density affects how many calories you're consuming over the day. So the more volume there is in your food, less calories per bite, the less calories you're likely to eat over that day. So these diets can be very good at helping someone, if they want to, lose weight as well, which helps improve insulin sensitivity. But insulin sensitivity is also improved independent of weight by the type of fat you're eating. And this is lost on people. The literature is very clear on this. Even if you're not losing weight, when you reduce saturated fat and increase polyunsaturated fats, you see improvements in blood glucose control. Insulin sensitivity improves. So you get that benefit. You'll see there are fairly robust associations with each of these diets with a lowering in inflammation. So less of, I'm talking about chronic inflammation here, not so much the acute inflammation that we want if we get injured or have an infection that we need to clear. Talking about that more low-grade inflammation that causes a lot of collateral damage. And
just sleep and
so that underpins a lot of these chronic disease processes, including dementia. So that's, I guess, a bunch. Certainly not limited to those, but those are some of the big reasons why shifting to these diets really protect you against chronic diseases that we've kind of normalized in our society, but it doesn't have to be that way.
In terms of like ease of entry, so low barrier to entry, what would be the taxonomy of those 4 diets in terms of like, is Mediterranean kind of the easiest of the 4? Like what would
This is one of the best questions I've ever been asked. I love it because it's so practical and it's often
I'm a coach.
It's often missed.
That's how I think.
We can go down all of these rabbit holes, and as I said, we have enough information. We just kind of need to make it simple for people and easy to grab a hold of. I would say that the Mediterranean diet is the sort of most comprehensive diet from the point of view of if you just want to adopt something and you don't really want to go to the next level of researching about certain nutrients of focus and filling some of the gaps, which you do need to do as you go to any extreme. If you were to go to the carnivore extreme or to the full vegan extreme, and some people may want to explore that territory, but you probably have to think a little bit less, and there's probably a little less that can go wrong with the Mediterranean style diet. Now, most people, when they think of Mediterranean diet, are probably not thinking about it how it is in the literature.
Yeah.
So we probably should sort of define that a little bit more. It's not necessarily just eating a lot of pizza and pasta and red wine.
Right.
I think there's room for a glass of red wine here and there to enjoy ourselves. But the diet is, again, it's based on lots of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes. So there is certainly much more emphasis on plant protein than there is in the standard diet. And when it comes to meat, it's leaner cuts of meat, which is important because that will reduce that saturated fat intake. The dairy that's included tends to be fermented dairy. And I think that's quite consistent with the literature. Looking at dairy foods, it's so mixed, and it's because there's all different types of dairy. And again, what are you comparing to? It seems like we should really be reducing our exposure to butter. That's going to really jack up your ApoB quite significantly. And that does
real trend there around butter.
There's a trend around, quote unquote ancestral eating, natural eating, and that's a whole nother discussion. But I don't think our ancestors were interested in longevity. So, and I don't think evolution is particularly concerned with how healthy you are at 70 or 80. I think evolution is mostly concerned with, are you going to procreate?
Exactly.
So I'm not sure adopting our ancestors' strategies is wise unless we have the same goals as them.
Yeah, being biologically relevant is totally different.
Right. I think most people listening want to procreate and be around for as long as possible to enjoy that time with their kids and their grandkids. So the Mediterranean diet is where we were talking about what the Mediterranean diet is and what it's not. It has that bias for plant protein, and then it's those leaner cuts of meats. There's fatty fish in that dietary pattern. I think that's a good sort of starting point. And to even go a step even more simpler here, I would say the biggest swap that someone could make if they're eating currently a diet that's not consistent with what we're describing is two swaps here, I would say. One is, instead of cooking with butter, cook with olive oil. And the second is, instead of eating red meat 4, 5, 6 times a week, try to half that and replace that with legumes. And naturally, what's going to happen here is you're going to lower your consumption of saturated fat. You're going to increase your plant protein, and you're going to increase your fiber. And these are all things that will shift those risk factors that we discussed before into the right direction. And that doesn't have to be an all or nothing play to begin with. I'll work with people that often I say, when people are like, I just don't know where to start, keep your recipes as they are. Don't go on Instagram and think you have to create these 3-4 hour long recipes every night of the week. That's not sustainable. You know your lasagna recipe or whatever you make. Okay, let's just say that there's a pound of minced beef in there. I'm translating that because I work in grams, but let's just say it's a pound of minced beef. Well, can you half that and have half minced beef, half lentils? You won't even know. It's going to taste the same. You just
do a quick rundown of what actually a legume is. Some folks might not even know that.
Yeah, so a legume is anything from lentils, chickpeas, beans. There's lots of different varieties of beans. It also includes tempeh, which is a fermented legume product. Often it's made with soy, but now it's made with chickpeas and other types of legumes as well. And tofu, that's another one.
Why do folks rail against legumes?
Where do we start? Soy and hormones comes up. People think that soy contains estrogen. It doesn't.
I mean, you'd have to have bags and bags of it, right? Like in order to...
And it doesn't contain estrogen. It contains polyphenols, which have been labeled as phytoestrogens. It's not estrogen. The reason that they're called phytoestrogens is that they can bind to the estrogen receptor. But there's a number of actual benefits that are up for grabs for that. And so you see in the literature, women in Asian populations who consume soy early in life have way lower risk of breast cancer. Because by binding to the receptor, the thing that people are overlooking is they're thinking that when it binds to the receptor, it's mimicking estrogen. But it's relative to estrogen, it's about 1,000 times weaker. And what it's doing is it's blocking estrogen. So a lot of these types of cancer, whether it is breast cancer or prostate cancer, they're hormone dependent cancers. So there might be some benefits up for grabs. I'm not saying that that's definitive, but if anything, it's leaning towards being positive for cancer risk reduction for certain types that are hormone driven. So people think that it contains estrogen. It doesn't. People think that it's going to mess with your hormones. And this has been tested in women and in men. Usually this comes from men who are worried about it. They think it's going to really tank their testosterone. There's a meta-analysis 2 years ago, looked at 41 clinical studies in humans. This is important because if you see someone making this claim, they're going to cite an animal study that was fed so much soy you would never be exposed to in your diet. This was 41 clinical trials from 2 weeks up to a year long, feeding varying amounts of soy and those phytoestrogens to men and looking at estrogen levels, looking at free testosterone, total testosterone, all the things. And there was no significant changes. There was nothing to be worried about. That was the conclusion of that paper. And am I saying that people should just eat unlimited amounts? I wouldn't recommend that for any food. Probably run into problems if you had unlimited dairy or unlimited, nuts and seeds. It's, we want a balanced, diverse diet, but 2 or 3 serves of that a day is not going to be an issue or something for people to worry about. The other thing that comes up is lectins. I'm sure you've heard that.
Yeah.
So this is another one, and this, I think explaining this also covers the whole plants are trying to kill us type message about defense chemicals in general.
Yeah.
The dose really matters here. So, as I kind of just pointed to, you can find an animal study where you isolate something out of a food, which firstly is not always reflective of how that compound acts within a food matrix. So you isolate it out and you expose an animal to it at an amount on a milligram per kilogram basis that we would never be exposed to. And for example, with lectins, you could show some increased inflammation or in animals, what would be described sort of colloquially leaky gut, increased intestinal permeability. But we have to remember that that's highly reductionist. It's not the right dose. So what we've seen at that level, while interesting and might be hypothesis generating, you have to test it. And maybe if there's no other studies, you might just take the precautionary principle and say, hey, we've seen that. Until we know more, let's not eat legumes. But this has been absolutely tested.
Yeah.
You can find studies where they fed humans lots of legumes, measure inflammation. If anything, they have reduced inflammation. Studies looking at hard health outcomes and in populations where people eat varying levels of legumes. People that eat more legumes are living longer. They have less risk of cardiovascular disease. The one thing that I would say is that it is quite clear that lectins can be a problem if you're not cooking your food or properly preparing your food. So there are some studies where people were fed raw, dried beans, basically. They were well undercooked.
Yeah.
And they had some digestive symptoms.
Right.
And so, I mean, no one's recommending anyone has rice that hasn't been soaked and cooked or legumes that, it would be really not enjoyable to eat any type of legume that hadn't been soaked and cooked.
Right.
And when you buy them in a canned form, they've already been soaked and cooked. Right. That's taken care of for you. But if when you bite into a legume, it should sort of sit in the back of your mouth and it's soft. Mm-hmm. If it's hard and crunchy, it's undercooked. And I wouldn't recommend you're consuming that. But people that are consuming them in the properly prepared way are experiencing better health. So I just think that that's another example where it is easy to kind of cherry pick a certain study and get people scared about lectins. Yeah. But I could do that with oxygen. I could honestly, I could, and I say this to people all the time, I could hook someone up to 100% oxygen, pure oxygen, and they'll pass out and I'll kill them. right? Does that mean that oxygen's toxic and not healthy?
Yeah.
Should we stop breathing? Oxygen in the air that we're breathing is 21%, and that at that dose, it's life sustaining. It's important. So the dose is really important here as well.
Yeah.
And this is just something
It's
for
not the
people
right
to be
logic.
aware of. With so much information coming out, I think it helps to be discerning.
Yeah.
What are we looking for? If you're looking for someone, if you're seeing that someone is generating a lot of fear, because fear drives clicks and the algorithm loves it.
Yeah.
Just be aware of where are they getting that information from. And often some of the clues are, these are people that are very overly dogmatic, confident. They're not speaking with any type of nuance or context, which I think some people, you can fall into the trap thinking that person knows more than the person who's putting in some caveats and saying maybe, perhaps. That can come off as a bit of weakness. But if I'm looking sort of outside of nutrition for someone to provide advice in another area of science, those are the type of things that I'm looking for.
Yeah, I think it's important and a really good call out. So I think legumes, it's important to get into because that's a feature of all these different diets. I think that, if people are looking to do Mediterranean and vegan, vegetarian, pescatarian, like legumes are going to need to be a feature of that diet, right? In order to kind of be as healthy as possible inside that diet.
Yeah, and to get enough protein. And I think that within the plant-based community, there are certainly quite a few people who kind of downplay the importance of protein.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a good idea.
Right.
I think that protein is really important. And that I think the discussion around protein and long-term health for me is more about the source, not the amount. I think we have to have more of an emphasis on plant protein, but I also think we need to get enough. And it is important for a number of different functions in the body, but particularly important for maintaining muscle mass and strength as we age, both of which are predictors of longevity.
What are the best plant proteins? Like, what do you kind of recommend?
Tofu, tempeh, all those other legumes that I just mentioned. There's also seitan if people are not celiac or gluten sensitive. TVP is another product that's not ultra processed and is very high in protein per calorie. So all of those are options. I think if you're an athlete, then adding in some type of protein powder can be convenient. I think athletes...
Is that the only way to get that full chain of amino acids? Like, how do you actually...
Yeah, that's a great question. Just to finish that, I think all athletes, not all, but most athletes use some type of protein powder from a convenience point of view. If they're trying to get to an optimal level, and that could be a whey protein or a plant protein kind of shake. The protein quality question is a good one. Protein's made up of amino acids, some of which are non-essential, some are essential. So 9 of them are essential, which means that our body's not making them. We require them through nutrition. And often I think people have been led to believe that plants are missing some of these essential amino acids. That's not quite correct. So maybe we can define that a little bit more. All plants contain all of the 9 essential amino acids. And I know when I was at university, they actually didn't teach us that. They taught us that quinoa and soy were complete proteins that contain all 9 essential amino acids, and other foods were missing them. That's not correct. What is correct is that the definition of complete and incomplete proteins needs to be understood here. It's not saying that if it's complete, it contains all 9, and if it's incomplete, it's missing those 9. What it's saying is an incomplete protein is a protein that if you ate that food for all of your calories, at the end of the day, you would fall short on your requirements for one or more of those amino acids. That's interesting, but it's really only interesting to people in developing countries that have no access to food. Right? That's where that becomes really important if someone's getting all their nutrition from one grain. But when you're eating with some, just a modest amount of diversity, providing you're eating enough calories and total protein, that takes care of itself. And you can see that in an app like Chronometer, which is a free app. Plug your food in, whichever one of these variations of diets that you choose over a day. I think this is good for people to do anyway for a little bit. I'm not saying that everyone needs to track their food and calories long term, but it can be helpful to see, what are you eating? how much saturated fat's in there, unsaturated fat? Are you getting all of these essential amino acids? Are you falling short on any micronutrients? That app will display that in a nice, very visual way. So I get people not to focus so much on, combining foods. I don't think people don't need to do that. What I do like them to focus on is just knowing they're eating enough protein.
Right.
Because when you're eating enough protein, enough calories, all those amino acids take care of themselves. So if you're not an athlete and you're someone who's just, recreationally working out, then 1.2 to 1.3 grams per kilogram, I'd say, is the lower amount where I'd want someone to land. There are people that argue that you only need 0.8 grams per kilo, which is the RDA. I'm not on that team.
Yeah.
I think that you're more likely to run into problems there in terms of recovery, ability to build muscle, stay strong. And there was a recent study just out that makes me believe that even more. And then if you're an athlete and you're really optimizing and you're training hard, you've got a lot of volume resistance training, then you want to be at least 1.5, 1.6 grams per kilogram. And that's going to help you recover. That's going to help you get the adaptations that you want. The exercise is the stimulus. It provides the stress. And then for the body to adapt, it needs the nutrition to come with it. But even at that 1.2 to 1.3 grams per kilo, when you look at studies that have looked at varying protein intakes and strength with resistance training, you get most of the benefit in strength by 1.2, 1.3 grams.
Yeah.
You squeeze out a little bit more as you get up to 1.5, 1.6, but it's not a huge amount.
Right.
Yeah.
I wonder, for folks who are not eating animal proteins, which in some ways is just easier to get protein, right? For the most part. Or maybe that's not true. And I'd love for you.
Well, I think it's easier for the average person who hasn't spent any time thinking about plant protein and where protein is found. Right. And so people are just kind of doing what they know. But with a very small amount of time invested, I reeled off those foods. Honestly, if you just put them side by side into a chart, you'll see how protein rich they can be.
Yeah.
And if you were to go and do 2 or 3 days of eating and including those foods in your meals, you'll see it adds up. So I can kind of understand on face value why it may seem easier, but you can definitely get enough protein from eating only plants. I personally only eat plants, and I had my DEXA scan today, and my fat-free mass is in top 5-10%.
Wow.
So it's certainly possible. And I'm not sitting around. I can't remember the last time I have ever counted protein. I'm not sitting around fussing about that. I just know what foods contain protein, and I make a concerted effort to feature them and emphasize them in my meals. So step one is just actually knowing where you find protein in plant foods.
Are plant foods, are they more calorically dense than like an animal protein?
Not necessarily. Often they're actually less calorically dense, which surprises people. Some foods like salmon are quite calorie dense foods, even though, we see them as healthy. And I would argue they are healthy. I think that fatty fish like that is the research shows positive health outcomes. But tofu is not more calorie dense than salmon.
Right.
And, TVP or seitan, which I mentioned before, which people can consume if they're not celiac or gluten sensitive, is like 80-90% protein. Wow. So it's absolutely possible to get enough protein without consuming extra calories. And I think that is something that people think, and there is the idea out there that, you'd have to eat more calories. That's not the case. I can make someone a meal plan with 2,000 calories that has 160, 170 grams of protein. And part of the art in that is manipulating some of the other kind of food groups, changing things around in terms of nuts and seeds and whole grains. Yeah.
So Mediterranean, what would be the next kind of diet that would pescatarian be kind of the next in terms of ease of entry?
Yeah, I think, as you sort of step away from Mediterranean and you're reducing animal foods, usually from just the point of view of being familiar
Yeah.
with something or less familiar.
So we're eliminating meat
and
right now.
social.
Now we're just
So
fish.
it's like the social element and also just what you're familiar with. It sort of gets a little bit trickier to navigate. And then also some of the nutrients that you need to be more aware of. So you step to pescatarian, that's, for most people that sort of land there, they find that quite sustainable. And there's really not a whole lot to think there around micronutrients because you're still getting some B12, you're getting DHA and EPA, omega-3s, you're getting iodine.
Yeah.
These are 3 of the nutrients that I would say are of focus as you step away from a pescatarian diet. So as you get into a more vegetarian or a vegan diet, then there are some micronutrients that you want to be aware of. Now, at the same time, the vegan diet also has a lot of extra pluses. It usually comes with much more plant protein, much more fiber, more polyphenols and antioxidants. So it's not just a trade. You're not just sort of stepping towards an inferior dietary pattern. There's pros and cons. All diets have pros, cons, some limitations, and it's just worth being aware of them. But certainly, probably have to be a little bit more aware as you're removing animal foods and shifting to plant exclusive, just to make sure you're not becoming deficient in a key micronutrient.
Have you noticed certain biomarkers for folks who maybe are, I'm just wondering if you have any data, folks who go from standard American diet, let's say, and then they shift to a plant-based diet. What would someone expect in terms of biomarker changes? I know this is pretty unique to an individual, but and any changes in sleep and heart rate variability. Is there anything that from the data that show?
Yeah. So from a biomarker point of view, the further you shift along that spectrum, the more that ApoB comes down. So we see from clinical intervention studies looking at essentially completely plant exclusive dietary patterns, maybe a little bit of animal foods, but not a lot. You can get about a 30% reduction in your LDL cholesterol, which is, akin to a 30% reduction in ApoB. We would assume they didn't necessarily measure ApoB in those studies, which is important. So if you're considered low risk of cardiovascular disease, so you don't have hypertension, type 2 diabetes, you haven't had a cardiovascular event, you're not a smoker, you want your ApoB at 80 milligrams per deciliter or lower. The average person in this country walking around is at about 120, 130. What does that mean? Well, that means that every day and every night they're laying down plaque in their artery. Yeah. We know that. There's studies showing that, where you look at people that do not have other cardiovascular risk factors but have varying levels of LDL cholesterol. And what you see is at this 120 to 130 level, which a lot of physicians would say is quote unquote normal.
Is that a relatively sedentary individual or?
No, well, you wouldn't assume so. I mean, these are people that have normal blood glucose. Okay. They don't have high blood pressure. They don't have type 2 diabetes. So we would assume that they're relatively healthy. They're going to probably be moving their body in some capacity. And at 120 to 130, at least half of them have subclinical atherosclerosis. So they're laying down plaque, and it's not causing a heart attack or stroke at that point in time because it takes decades. So those people, if they don't get on top of that through diet or through pharmacology, will be one of the statistics when they're 50, 60, 70, where they have a stroke or a heart attack. So you can expect about a 30% reduction in that figure through diet if you take it more towards the extreme. And that's how I would say for people to navigate this. I think as you're making changes and you're sort of trading down on some of these animal foods, whether it's Mediterranean or pescatarian, retest. Where is ApoB at? Is it, if you're a low risk person, is it below 80? No? Okay. Do you want to make some more changes? If not, if you say, I don't want to make any more changes, well, maybe you can think about pharmacology to help you get there.
Right.
So, or if you're high risk, and so you've had a cardiovascular event, or you have type 2 diabetes, or you're a smoker, or a combination of these, hypertension, then ApoB should be at 50 milligrams per deciliter or lower.
Right.
So you might be motivated to make more changes to your diet, particularly if you're someone who's thinking, I don't want to be relying on a medication. Well, then that person might say, you know what, I'm going to make all the dietary changes that I can make. And they have a lot of motivation to do it and they can adhere to it. Or again, it might be a combination of the two. Blood pressure wise, you can probably bring that down by 10 millimeters of mercury, which I mentioned before, which is about a 25% risk reduction in of stroke, heart attacks, or other vascular events. You would certainly see improvements in your blood glucose. So HbA1c, fasting glucose, but also triglycerides if you're not eating refined carbohydrates. That's important. So again, your carbohydrates are mostly coming from fruit, whole grains, and legumes, not from packaged foods, cookies and cakes and pizzas and white flour stuff. How much those numbers will improve will be a little bit subject to whether or not you lose weight. If you do lose weight and you're able to reduce particularly the fat that is in and around your organs, so visceral fat and ectopic fat, that's the really metabolically damaging fat.
Right.
And again, I said before that one of the sort of nice things about these dietary patterns is their low calorie density. So they can help people lose some weight and clear out some of that visceral fat, the ectopic fat that is leading to the insulin resistance and elevated blood sugar. So they can really improve their metabolic health and lower inflammation. I mentioned before. There are a number of things that people see on their blood tests. You mentioned sleep. Again, if you lose weight, you're going to sleep a lot better. If you exercise more, you'll sleep a lot better. So all these things are kind of tied together.
Our members have the ability to track various diets. So we have as options, paleo and vegan and vegetarian and intermittent fasting regime, which I really want to ask you about, and ketogenic and dairy-free diet.
What do you see? I'd love to know.
Oh, yeah. I have those data. Can you guess?
I think probably any number of those is probably better than a standard American diet. But I'm betting that a lot of people using Whoop aren't eating a standard American diet.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely trend toward the healthier folks without a doubt. But yeah, we basically took all the members' data who are tracking these things consistently. We took all their data from the month of June. And we found that the average resting heart rate among members across all 6 diets was actually lower than the average of the age and gender matched group. So we had kind of an age and gender matched control group, and then we had all these people who are tracking diets. And the vegans saw the lowest resting heart rate, and theirs was 55 beats per minute compared to the gender matched group, which was 60 beats per minute.
Did you look at recovery? Did that translate to better recovery? Or
Yep. So I'll get there. Yeah. So, and yeah, I guess just wondering, I think you kind of alluded to this, but I think the lower, the less inflammation, the lower your resting heart rate, generally, the better your sleep. But would love to hear just your thoughts on why you think the lower resting heart rate, for the vegan group was, even maybe even above vegetarian.
I'm hypothesizing here because I haven't seen. I mean, this is interesting for me because I've kind of wanted more data to speak to this
kind of
because
data,
anecdotally, and I don't love anecdotes, but anecdotes can be more interesting when there isn't any data out there. And anecdotally, one of the kind of areas where you hear a lot of people adopting a plant-based, particularly vegan diet is towards the end of their career. So it's like the older athlete who's having difficulties with recovery.
It's not adapting as well as maybe they were previously.
And they'll say that their sleep improved and their recovery time improved. And to date, the hypothesis has just been that, well, they're probably less inflamed. And my lab tests sort of corroborate that in terms of my inflammation is extremely low. So is my visceral fat. So on my DEXA scan, my visceral fat was 0.01 pounds, which is basically nothing. And I think that comes back to this too. So that comes back to the type of fat that we're consuming, but also whether we're in a calorie surplus or not. So I'm very active. I'm probably not in a calorie surplus often. And my fats are mostly unsaturated. And when you keep that visceral fat down, you will reduce inflammation a lot. That visceral fat is very inflammatory. So, I mean, that's interesting data, but I think it probably ties back to inflammation.
Yep. And heart rate variability, the vegetarian diet saw the highest heart rate variability. That group was 59.47. Yeah. So anything different in the vegetarian diet that might yield a kind of higher HRV, which is, good corollary to recovery and, inflammation.
I mean, what vegetarians relative to vegans are often getting a little bit more calcium, potentially a little bit more protein. So, those are usually the two big differences in the diet. I'm not sure how those are interacting with HRV, but again, interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. And also sleep quality and duration and consistency. So the degree to which you stabilize when you go to bed and you wake up, which is more behavior routine type thing, was best in the vegan and vegetarian group.
Interesting.
And I know we're kind of winding down, but I would love for you to talk a little bit about just sustainability and environment, and just what's your philosophy there? I know that this is an area that you think a lot about.
Yeah, I think if we're privileged enough and to be able to consider how our food choices affect the world around us, I think we have to. So I really appreciate that not everyone is that privileged. There are people in developing countries or people in low socioeconomic status that are just trying to make it through to the next day. Yeah. So this is a very privileged conversation, but it's extremely clear that food is impacting the environment in a number of ways, and more so than fossil fuels, in that fossil fuels is mostly greenhouse gas emissions, and food certainly is affecting greenhouse gas emissions, and there are greenhouse gas emissions attached to the food that we eat. But it's so much more than that. We've turned Earth into a farm. And so if someone values the environment, like they enjoy getting out into nature and they feel better from that, then I think they're the type of person that does want to do the right thing by the environment. Like, we're taking from it, let's give back. And when you look at, so greenhouse gas emissions are certainly much higher on a per gram of protein or per kilogram or pound of food for animal foods relative to plant foods. Now, there's a deep discussion there because it's not all the same. Like beef and lamb are right at the top in terms of the biggest contributors, and then it drops off a lot with pork and chicken and eggs, much smaller. But relative to any of those, to produce those protein sources that I said before, like tofu or tempeh or legumes, we're talking in the realm of 20 to 40 times less greenhouse gas emissions. It's a lot. It adds up. And probably the most important thing, though, is the land use. So I said we've turned Earth into a farm. More than 50% of habitable land is used for agriculture. And 83% of that land is used for animal agriculture, both through having animals on land and grazing, or also growing crops directly to feed into those animal food systems. But that 83% of land is only giving us 18% of our protein. It's extremely inefficient. So what is up for grabs here is, if we can get the world to shift to more plant protein, it means we can use less land. We free up land. And this is where a sustainable food system actually ends up, is in conservation. It's taking land that's currently used for agriculture and rewilding it, restoring it into natural habitats that sustain the Earth's systems. And people will often say, well, how are we going to do that? Because farmers own this land. They bought it. They've invested. They have mortgages. And this is not about wiping out farmers and making them bankrupt. The entire sustainability, or the ability for us to address this problem, rests on shifting incentives. So right now, what is a farmer incentivized to do? They've got this land, they've paid this mortgage, they need to generate some type of income. The only thing that they are incentivized to do is to extract calories out of that land.
Yeah, turn out
they
as much
have
food
to
as possible.
dominate the land.
Yeah.
Right. And so domination is what has got us into this place it got us here in the first place. So if we want to work with the land, we have to get away from a domination mindset. And the only way to do that is to shift the incentives. So if you own some land, instead of me saying the only way you're going to get paid is by producing beef calories or whatever you're used to doing, I'm going to pay you to restore and rewild. I'm going to pay you based on biodiversity. Now we start creating an ecosystem that is actually considering the environment. And we reduce our overall agriculture footprint so we can produce more calories from less land. And in the process, we bring back biodiversity, we bring back water stores. There's less eutrophication, which is pollution into waterways where you get algal blooms and it starts to starve animals of oxygen, and you get all these dead zones in water. And when these ecosystems come back, it creates a more resilient environment. That's what environmental resilience is, biodiversity. And so if we are appreciating nature and we want to give back to it, we have to think about the way that we're consuming. And each time we're voting for a world where there's more deforestation and less nature, or more nature, greater biodiversity, and something that we can enjoy and our kids can enjoy, and future humans.
Yeah. Where's the best place for people to learn more about that specifically?
Chapter 9
Perfect.
of my book. That's a plug.
Great.
No, they can read that there. That chapter.
It's not talked about.
Yeah, I mean that chapter
was
one of the most eye-opening chapters that I wrote, and it was really inspired by. I had a number of conversations on my show with people like Hannah Ritchie from Our World in Data. She's a geoscientist, and it's interesting to think about how all these people eat. So she's pescatarian. And then Jonathan Foley, who is at Project Drawdown, which is a big sort of climate change organization. And he eats a little bit of meat, but it's like very, very rarely based on all of this research. And Nicholas Carter, who's an environmental scientist, he's been on the show a number of times, and we've talked about regenerative grazing and some of the claims that come out of that. So yeah, read chapter 9, and there's a bunch of those episodes that people can go and listen to if they want. And then Our World in Data is this website that is absolutely fantastic. You can go on there and you can get super granular and look at all of the different foods that we might eat, greenhouse gas emissions, land use, eutrophication, water use, all of that. And it compares everything. So you get a sort of good relativity to it.
Beautiful. Well, this has been really fascinating. I appreciate your time. Where I know your Instagram is amazing and you have loads of followers. Is that the best place for folks to kind of follow you, would you say? Or
yeah, that or the podcast. So I probably connect with people most on the podcast, which is The Proof.
Yep.
And from a social media point of view, I'm across all the platforms. Instagram is at Simon Hill. And then if you want to get a little bit more nerdy, Twitter and your game for everything that takes place on Twitter. It's an interesting place, and you can find me at The Proof on there.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been
awesome.
It's
been a pleasure. Appreciate it.
Thank you to Simon Hill for coming on the Whoop podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating or review. Please subscribe to the Whoop podcast. Check us out on social at Whoop, at Will Ahmed. If you have a question you want to see answered on the podcast, email us podcast@whoop.com. Call us 508-443-4952. If you're thinking about joining Whoop, you can sign up for free 30-day trial. If you like it, stay on it. If you don't, send it back. It's about as good as it gets. New members can use the code WILL. Alternatively, get a $60 credit on Whoop accessories. And that's a wrap. Thank you all for listening. We'll catch you next week on the Whoop podcast.